The deputy slammed my daughter against the patrol car, her face pressed against the cold metal. I watched in horror from across the street, frozen in disbelief. This was not supposed to happen in our quiet town. Not to my child. Not over a photograph. You think you are funny. You think you can disrespect the law. Sheriff Sheila's voice cut through the air like a knife as she circled my terrified daughter. My legal training told me to stay calm, to document everything, but my parental instinct screamed to intervene. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and started recording. The sheriff noticed immediately. And here comes Daddy to the rescue. Former big city lawyer thinks he knows the law better than me. Her lips curved into a cruel smile. In my town, I am the law. That is when I saw her slip something into my daughter's backpack while the deputy held her against the car. My blood ran cold. Sheriff Sheila was not just bullying my child, she was planting evidence. And in that moment, I knew this small-town tyrant had no idea who she was dealing with. The irony never escaped me. After 15 years of teaching civil procedure and constitutional law at Boston University, I had moved to Pinewood to escape the very systems I once taught my students to navigate. The small town promised the quiet life my daughter Emma and I desperately needed after her mother passed 3 years ago. Cancer takes no prisoners, not even brilliant defense attorneys like my late wife. The move was difficult for Emma. 16 is a challenging age even without being uprooted from friends and familiar surroundings, but she adapted with a resilience that constantly reminded me of her mother. Within months, she had secured a volunteer position at the local library and joined the debate team at Pinewood High. Her grades remained exceptional, and for the first time since the funeral, I heard her laughing again. Our house sat on the edge of town, a modest 3-bedroom with a wraparound porch where I graded papers from the online courses I still taught. The neighbors were friendly enough, bringing casseroles and offering rides when my car broke down. It was exactly the environment I had hoped for: peaceful, supportive, uncomplicated. That changed the first time I encountered Sheriff Sheila Moss. It happened at the town's annual 4th of July picnic. She stood apart from the crowd, uniform pressed to perfection, sunglasses reflecting the summer sun as she surveyed the gathering like a hawk watching for field mice. There was something in her posture, an unmistakable projection of authority, that caught my professional attention. "That is Sheriff Moss," whispered Mrs. Henderson, who had invited us to join her family's picnic table. "Best not to get on her bad side." I nodded politely but thought little of it. In my experience, small-town law enforcement often cultivated intimidating personas to compensate for limited resources. Besides, we had no reason to cross paths with local police. Emma was a model student, and I kept to myself. Later that day, I noticed how people parted ways when Sheriff Moss walked through the crowd. Not out of respect, I realized, but out of fear. Children quieted their games. Teenage conversations ceased mid-sentence. Even the mayor seemed to choose his words carefully in her presence. "Dad, why does everyone act weird around her?" Emma asked as we walked home that evening. "Some people confuse fear with respect when they are in positions of authority," I explained, falling automatically into professor mode. "It is important to recognize the difference between earned respect and coerced compliance." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "We learned about that in debate, power dynamics, and institutional accountability." I smiled, proud of her insight. "Exactly. The badge means you uphold the law, not that you are above it." How naive those words would soon seem. For the next few months, we settled deeper into our new life. I published a paper on Fourth Amendment violations in rural communities. Emma excelled in her advanced placement courses and made friends who shared her love of books and social justice. We were healing, building something new from the fragments of our broken family. Then came winter, and with it, the first signs of trouble. Reports circulated about increased traffic stops, particularly targeting the Hispanic workers at the orchard outside town. I heard whispers at the grocery store about questionable searches, citations for obscure municipal code violations, and overnight holds without proper cause. Just Sheila cleaning up the town, I overheard at the coffee shop. About time someone took a firm hand, another voice agreed. I recognized the dangerous comfort of those who believe authority without accountability keeps them safe. I had taught my students about this precise phenomenon, how easily constitutional protections erode when fear masquerades as security. But I had my daughter to think about, a new life to protect. So I said nothing, did nothing. That was my first mistake. The incident that changed everything happened on a Monday in February. I was deep into grading midterm essays when my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, check out the PD's finest," it read, accompanied by a photo of a police cruiser stuck in a snowbank outside the high school, its wheels spinning uselessly against the ice. She had added a caption, "Guess they should have listened to the weather advisory like the rest of us." I smiled at her humor but sent back a quick response, "Careful who sees that, Em." It was innocent enough, a momentary lapse in judgment that any teenager might make. The photo showed no officers, no faces, just a patrol car in an embarrassing situation. Emma had only shared it with her close friends through a private account, but someone had taken a screenshot, and within hours, the image was circulating throughout Pinewood's digital grapevine. By Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from the school principal, Dr. Richards. "Mr. Lawson, there has been an incident involving Emma. I think you should come down to the school immediately." His voice carried an edge of tension that made my stomach drop. "Is she hurt?" "No, but Sheriff Moss is here and insists on speaking with both of you." I arrived at the school 15 minutes later to find Emma sitting outside the principal's office, her face pale, hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she saw me, relief washed over her features. "Dad, I did not mean." I squeezed her shoulder. "Let me handle this." Inside the office, Sheriff Moss stood with her back to the window, casting her face in shadow. Dr. Richards sat behind his desk, visibly uncomfortable. The tension in the room was palpable. "Mr. Lawson," Sheriff Moss did not extend her hand, "your daughter has been engaging in behavior designed to undermine the authority of law enforcement in this community." I kept my voice measured. "I understand she took a photograph of a police vehicle. Last I checked, that falls well within her First Amendment rights." Sheriff Moss removed her sunglasses, revealing cold blue eyes. "This is not about constitutional theory, Professor. This is about respect, about teaching young people that actions have consequences." Dr. Richards cleared his throat. "Perhaps we can discuss this calmly. Emma is an excellent student with no prior disciplinary issues." Sheriff Moss ignored him, taking a step toward me. "You may have taught fancy law courses in Boston, but this is Pinewood. We handle things differently here." "And how exactly do you handle things?" I asked, feeling a familiar courtroom tension building in my chest. The door opened and Emma stepped in. "Dad, it was just a stupid joke. I will delete it and apologize." Sheriff Moss turned toward her, and something in her expression made my parental alarms blare. It was more than annoyance or authority. It was targeted malice. "Young lady, you need to learn about real-world consequences," she said, her voice dropping dangerously low. Next time you take pictures of my department, you better have a good lawyer with you. And even then, evidence has a funny way of appearing where it is needed most. Mrs. Abernathy, Emma's English teacher who had apparently been standing in the doorway, gasped audibly. "Sheriff, surely that is not appropriate." Sheriff Moss straightened her uniform, just making sure we all understand each other. She nodded curtly and strode from the room, brushing past Emma with deliberate force. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Richards looked shaken. "Mr. Lawson, I want to assure you that the school does not condone such intimidation tactics." "Did everyone hear what she just said?" I asked, looking between the principal and the teacher. "Did you hear her threaten my 16-year-old daughter?" Mrs. Abernathy nodded slowly. "I heard it clearly. It was completely unprofessional." I turned to Emma, whose eyes were wide with shock. "Let us go home, sweetheart." As we walked to the car, Emma's composure finally broke. "Dad, I am sorry. I did not think it would be such a big deal." I pulled her into a hug, my mind racing through legal precedents and case studies. "This is not your fault. What she did in there was an abuse of power, plain and simple." "She really scared me," Emma admitted, her voice small. "I know." I opened the car door for her. "But remember what I always taught you about bullies with badges." Emma nodded. "They count on fear to keep people quiet." "Exactly, and we are not going to be quiet." Yet even as I said it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. Sheriff Moss had not made an empty threat. She had made a promise, and something told me she intended to keep it. The retaliation began subtly. 2 days after the incident at school, I noticed a patrol car parked across from our house when I left for my morning run. The officer inside made no attempt to appear casual. He stared directly at me, making eye contact before slowly writing something in his notebook. The next morning, the same car followed the school bus carrying Emma to Pinewood High. When she texted me about it, I told her to remain calm and document the time and patrol car number. My legal mind was already cataloging each incident, each potential violation. "Dad, everyone at school is treating me differently," Emma told me over dinner that evening. "Like I am radioactive or something." I set down my fork. "Different how?" "Some kids think it is cool that I stood up to Sheriff Moss. Others are avoiding me completely. Tyler Jenkins said his dad told him not to hang out with me anymore because I am trouble." The injustice of it burned in my chest. "You are not trouble, Emma. You never have been." "I know that, but it still hurts." She pushed her plate away. "And today I got called to the office. They gave me a citation for inappropriate online behavior that disrupts the educational environment. It goes in my permanent record." I reached for the paper she pulled from her backpack. The citation was vague, referencing a school policy that prohibited digital content that undermines community authority figures. It was signed by the vice principal, a man I had yet to meet. "This is absurd," I said, reading it twice. "This policy could never stand up to legal scrutiny." "But it exists, and now I have a mark on my record." Emma's voice trembled slightly. "Mom would know exactly what to do." The mention of Catherine hit me hard. She would have marched into that school with righteous fury, dismantling their flimsy citation with surgical precision. I had always been the analytical one, the professor who examined cases from all angles. She had been the fighter. "We will address this properly," I promised, "through the right channels." Emma nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She had inherited her mother's intuition. She knew this was just the beginning. She was right. 3 days later, we returned home to find a notice taped to our front door. No letterhead, no official seal, just a typed message. Raise her right or we will. The implied threat hung in the air between us as Emma looked at me with wide eyes. Dad. I removed the paper carefully, holding it by the edges. Go inside and lock the door. I need to make a call. That evening, I contacted an old colleague from my teaching days, now working at the ACLU. I explained the situation, described the escalating pattern of intimidation. Document everything, she advised. Times, dates, witnesses. If this sheriff is abusing her authority, we can build a case. The following day, I requested a meeting with Sheriff Moss. It was time to confront this directly, to see if reason could prevail before things escalated further. Her office at the Pinewood Sheriff's Department was exactly what I expected, austere, immaculate, with her credentials and commendations prominently displayed. She kept me waiting for 30 minutes before calling me in. Professor Lawson, she said, not rising from behind her desk. What can I do for Boston University's finest? I placed the notice from our door on her desk. I would like to discuss this, and the pattern of intimidation my daughter has experienced since your visit to her school. Sheriff Moss glanced at the paper without touching it. I cannot be responsible for every anonymous note in this town. The timing seems rather coincidental, I replied evenly, as does the patrol car that has been monitoring our house and following my daughter to school. A cold smile touched her lips. We increase patrols where we see potential problems developing, purely preventative. My 16-year-old daughter is not a problem, Sheriff. She took a photograph in a public space, which is her constitutional right. Sheriff Moss leaned forward. Let me explain something, Professor. I have kept this town safe for 12 years. I know every corner, every family, every secret. Your fancy law degree and big city ideas do not change how things work here. And how do things work here? By intimidating minors, by abusing your authority. Her expression hardened. Watch yourself. Civil rights do not mean much if you cannot protect them. She stood up. This meeting is over. I have actual police work to attend to. As I drove home, her threat echoed in my mind. This was not a misunderstanding or an overreaction to a teenage prank. This was systemic abuse of power, the very subject I had taught for years. Sheriff Moss operated like a small-town dictator, using fear to maintain control. Emma was waiting anxiously when I returned. How did it go? I considered softening the truth, protecting her from the reality of our situation. But Emma deserved honesty. Not well. She basically confirmed she is behind the intimidation without admitting it directly. So what do we do now? There was fear in her voice, but determination too. I placed my hands on her shoulders, feeling a resolve solidify within me. We fight back, not with fear or force, but with the law. It is time to put my years of teaching to practical use. That night, I began creating a detailed log of every incident, every interaction with Sheriff Moss and her deputies. I reached out to former students now practicing civil rights law. If Sheriff Moss wanted to play hardball, she would soon discover she had targeted the wrong family. The basement of our house transformed into what Emma jokingly called the war room. I pinned a large cork board to the wall where we mapped out every incident involving Sheriff Moss and her deputies. Red threads connected related events, creating a visual representation of the pattern of harassment. My legal background made me meticulous about documentation. Each encounter was time-stamped, photographed when possible, and corroborated wherever we could find witnesses. This feels like we are detectives in a crime show, Emma remarked one evening as she helped me organize our growing files. In a way, we are, I replied. Except our goal is not to solve a crime but to prevent one, the crime of continued civil rights violations. Emma had bounced back from her initial fear with remarkable resilience. The intimidation tactics had awakened something in her, a sense of justice and purpose that reminded me again of her mother. She began researching similar cases of small-town police overreach, creating a database of precedents we might use. My first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor who had warned us about Sheriff Moss at the 4th of July picnic, knocked on our door one evening. "I saw what happened at the school," she said, her voice low as though afraid of being overheard even on my front porch. "My daughter works as an administrative assistant there. Sheriff Moss has been doing this for years, targeting people who question her authority." I invited her inside, and over coffee, she shared stories that made my blood run cold. A Hispanic family whose teenage son was held overnight for a broken tail light. An elderly man whose pain medication was confiscated during a dubious traffic stop. A single mother whose welfare benefits were threatened after she complained about deputy harassment. "Why has no one reported this?" I asked. Mrs. Henderson gave me a sad smile. "Who would they report it to? Sheriff Moss is the law in Pinewood. The mayor depends on her support for re-election. The county commissioners are all her fishing buddies. People have tried to speak up before. They either leave town afterward or learn to keep quiet." "Would you be willing to make a formal statement about what you have told me?" I asked. She hesitated, fear flashing across her face. "I have 2 kids in college. My husband works for the town." I nodded, understanding her reluctance. "I will keep your name out of it for now, but if things escalate, having witnesses willing to come forward could make all the difference." After Mrs. Henderson left, I shared her stories with Emma. "This is bigger than just us," I told her. "Sheriff Moss has been operating like this for years because no one has challenged her effectively." Emma's expression grew serious. "So we are not just defending ourselves anymore. We are standing up for everyone she has hurt." "Exactly, which means we need more evidence, more testimonies." Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully approached other families mentioned in Mrs. Henderson's stories. Some doors closed in my face immediately. Others invited me in but would only speak in whispers, refusing to go on record. Fear ran deep in Pinewood. Then came the email that changed everything. It arrived from an anonymous account with the subject line, "R.E. Sheriff Moss Investigation." "Mr. Lawson, I served as a deputy under Sheriff Moss for 4 years before resigning last summer. I have documentation of procedural violations, falsified reports, and targeted harassment campaigns against citizens who crossed her. I saw what she did to your daughter. It is not the first time. If you are serious about building a case, I can help. Meet me at Miller's Diner, booth in the back, Thursday at 2 p.m. Come alone." The former deputy, who eventually identified himself as Robert Mercer, arrived at our meeting wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. He slid a thumb drive across the table. "Everything is there," he said quietly. "Patrol logs showing systematic targeting of certain households. Citation patterns that violate equal protection. Internal memos directing deputies to make examples of specific residents. I kept copies of everything because I knew someday someone would need to stop her." "Why did you not report this yourself?" I asked, pocketing the drive. Mercer removed his sunglasses, revealing tired eyes. "I tried. County Oversight Board is in her pocket. State investigators said it was a local matter. I have a family to support, Mr. Lawson, but I never stopped looking for the right opportunity." "And you think this is it, my daughter and I?" He nodded slowly. "You have the legal knowledge she lacks, and you have nothing to lose here, no roots, no local business depending on her goodwill. Plus, she made a crucial mistake targeting your daughter at school with witnesses present. That night, I reviewed the files Mercer had provided. They painted a damning picture of systematic civil rights abuses spanning years. The most disturbing pattern involved the targeting of vulnerable residents, immigrants, the elderly, teenagers, people less likely to have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. I printed key documents, highlighting the most egregious violations. Then I called Emma downstairs. "Look at this," I said, spreading the papers across our dining table. "This is what we are dealing with. A pattern of deliberate civil rights violations that has gone unchecked for years." Emma studied the documents, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "These are real people, Dad. People she hurt because no one could stop her." "Yes, and there are likely many more we do not know about." She looked up at me, determination hardening in her eyes. "Then we have to stop her, not just for us, for all of them." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and concern. My daughter was right, of course, but I also knew that Sheriff Moss would not go down without a fight, and as the evidence mounted, so did the risk she posed to us. "We need to be strategic," I said. "Build an ironclad case before we make any public moves." But Sheriff Moss was already watching us too closely, and the confrontation I had hoped to postpone was about to be forced upon us. The call came during my afternoon lecture. I had just finished explaining the concept of qualified immunity to my online students when my phone vibrated with Emma's ringtone. I never took calls during class, but something, intuition or parental instinct, made me excuse myself to answer. "Dad," her voice was shaking, barely audible. "Emma, what is wrong?" She stopped me walking home from the library. "Sheriff Moss. She says she got a tip about drugs in my backpack. She wants to search it." The fear in her voice cut through me like a knife. I told her no, that I know my rights. She said she would detain me if I refused. My professor persona vanished instantly. "Where are you exactly?" "Corner of Maple and Pine. Dad, I am scared." "Stay on the phone with me. Do not let her search your bag without a warrant. I am coming right now." I ended my class abruptly and drove like a man possessed. My mind raced through search and seizure law. Without reasonable suspicion that rose to the level of probable cause, Sheriff Moss had no legal right to search my daughter's belongings. This was a fishing expedition, or worse, an opportunity to plant evidence. I arrived to find Emma standing on the sidewalk, clutching her backpack to her chest. Sheriff Moss loomed over her, one hand resting casually on her holstered weapon. A deputy stood nearby, arms crossed. Several passers-by had stopped to watch from a distance. I parked haphazardly and approached with my phone already recording. "Emma, are you all right?" Relief washed over her face. "Dad." Sheriff Moss turned to me with a cold smile. "Professor Lawson, perfect timing. Your daughter is refusing a lawful search." "There is nothing lawful about this search, Sheriff. What probable cause do you have?" "Anonymous tip about narcotics. That is all I need." I stepped between her and Emma. "That is factually and legally incorrect. An anonymous tip without specific, articulable facts does not constitute probable cause for a warrantless search." Terry v. Ohio, 1968. Her eyes narrowed. "This is not your classroom, Professor. This is my town." "This is the United States of America, Sheriff, where the Constitution still applies." I held up my phone. "And all of this is being recorded." She glanced at my phone, the first hint of uncertainty crossing her features. "Recording an officer can be obstruction of justice." Glick v. Cuniff established the First Amendment right to record police officers performing their duties in public. First Circuit Court of Appeals, 2011. The cases flowed from my memory automatically, armor forged from years of teaching. By now, a small crowd had gathered. I recognized Mrs. Henderson among them, along with several parents from Emma's school. Their presence gave me courage. "You are interfering with a police investigation," Sheriff Moss insisted, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "I am protecting my daughter's Fourth Amendment rights." I turned to the deputy. "Officer, I presume you would like to avoid a civil rights lawsuit. I suggest you advise the sheriff that this detention lacks legal foundation." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, looking between Sheriff Moss and the growing audience of townspeople. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "maybe we should continue this at the station." Sheriff Moss's face flushed with anger. She leaned close to me, her voice a harsh whisper. "You think you are clever, Professor. This is not over, not by a long shot." "I certainly hope not," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "because I am just getting started documenting your pattern of civil rights violations." Something dangerous flashed in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might escalate further. Instead, she stepped back and addressed the gathered crowd. "Nothing to see here, folks, just a misunderstanding." She pointed at Emma. "You watch yourself, young lady." As Sheriff Moss and her deputy returned to their patrol car, Emma collapsed against me, trembling. "Dad," she was going to plant something in my bag. I could tell. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached us. An older man patted my shoulder. About time someone stood up to her. A woman whispered, "Call me if you need another witness." Mrs. Henderson simply nodded, her eyes communicating what she dared not say aloud. That evening, Emma and I sat on our porch swing, processing the day's events. The confrontation had shaken her, but something else had emerged, a sense of empowerment. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but when you showed up and started citing those cases, it was like watching Mom in court." The comparison to Catherine brought an unexpected lump to my throat. "She would be incredibly proud of you, standing your ground like that." Emma leaned her head against my shoulder. "What happens now?" I watched the sun setting over Pinewood, casting long shadows across our adopted hometown. In my mind, I reviewed the evidence we had gathered, the testimonies waiting to be shared, the legal precedents that would form our case. "Now we go public," I said firmly. "Sheriff Moss thrives in shadows and silence, so we bring everything into the light." "Will it be enough?" I squeezed her hand. "It has to be, because if we do not stand up to this kind of tyranny, who will?" As darkness fell, I made a series of calls to civil rights attorneys, to journalists I had connections with, to former students now working in state government. The time for quiet documentation had passed. Sheriff Sheila Moss had forced our hand, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. The war room in our basement would soon become command central for something much bigger than our personal fight. Pinewood was about to learn what happens when you threaten the daughter of someone who spent 15 years teaching others how to dismantle abuses of power. The night before the town meeting, I could not sleep. I rehearsed my presentation over and over, checking every detail, every piece of evidence. My daughter found me at 3 a.m., still awake in the kitchen, surrounded by papers. "Dad," she said, her voice small in the darkness, "what if nobody believes us?" I looked at her, this brave young woman who had endured weeks of intimidation just for taking a photograph. Her question hung in the air between us. It was the same question that had kept me awake. "They will," I answered, with more confidence than I felt, Because the truth is on our side. Morning came too quickly. The community center was already filling up when we arrived. I recognized parents from the school, teachers, shop owners, faces that had become familiar in our quiet life here. Most avoided eye contact. Some nodded slightly. The tension in the room was palpable, like the air before a storm. I took position near the podium, arranging my files. My hands were steady, but my mouth was dry. Years of teaching law had prepared me for public speaking, but this was different. This was personal. Through the crowd, I spotted Sheriff Sheila entering from the back, flanked by two deputies. Her expression was amused, almost bored, as she took a seat in the last row. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying across the now silent room. "My name is Michael Harrington. Many of you know me as Sarah's father. I moved to this town because I believed it was safe. I believed it respected the law." The projector flickered to life behind me, displaying the first photograph, my daughter's original post that had started everything. This is where it began, a teenager's harmless joke. And this, I clicked to the next slide, showing the school citation, is where the harassment started. Murmurs rippled through the audience. I continued methodically through each piece of evidence, the warning on our door, the patrol car logs showing unusual activity near our home, audio recordings of veiled threats. With each new revelation, the murmurs grew louder. "Your sheriff has engaged in a systematic campaign of intimidation against a minor," I said, my voice growing stronger. Not because of any crime, but because of a photograph that hurt her pride. From the back, I heard Sheriff Sheila's cold laugh. "This is ridiculous," she called out. "A father covering for his disrespectful child." I smiled thinly. "I was hoping you would speak up, Sheriff." I clicked to the next slide, a transcript of her threat at the school with the teacher's sworn statement. "Would you like to explain this to the town you serve?" The room fell silent. Then a woman stood up, Mrs. Jenkins, whose son worked at the library with my daughter. "My boy was detained last year," she said, her voice trembling. 3 hours in a cell because he was suspicious near the park after sunset. He was 16. Another parent stood, then another, a retired teacher, the owner of the hardware store. One by one, they shared stories of intimidation, of excessive force, of fear, stories they had kept quiet until now. Sheriff Sheila's face had lost its smugness. She stood abruptly. "This is a coordinated attack on law enforcement. These people have no proof." "We have plenty," came a voice from the doorway. A man in a suit entered, flanked by a camera crew. "Channel 7 News. We received an anonymous tip about this meeting." He nodded to me. "Please continue." For 2 hours we laid it all bare. The evidence, the testimonies, the pattern of abuse. The reporters took notes and filmed everything. Sheriff Sheila and her deputies slipped out halfway through, but it did not matter anymore. The truth was coming out, flowing like a river that had been dammed too long. When it was over, people lingered, talking in hushed but urgent tones. Some approached me with handshakes, with tearful thanks, with more stories. My daughter stood beside me, no longer frightened but proud. "You did it, Dad," she whispered. I shook my head, putting my arm around her shoulders. "No, we all did it. This is just the beginning." As we walked home under the stars, I knew tomorrow would bring consequences. But for tonight, the weight had lifted. The town had found its voice, and Sheriff Sheila had lost her power of silence. The morning after the town hall meeting, my phone would not stop ringing. Local reporters, parents from the school, and then a call from a number I did not recognize. "Mr. Harrington, this is Attorney Daniel Weiss with the State Civil Liberties Union." The voice was crisp, professional. "We saw the news report about your situation. I believe we should talk." By the end of the week, our kitchen table had become command central. Two civil rights attorneys pored over my files, nodding and making notes. My daughter watched from the doorway, both anxious and amazed at what her single photograph had unleashed. "This is textbook abuse of power," said Weiss, looking up from a stack of affidavits. "Multiple violations of First Amendment rights, intimidation of a minor, abuse of official capacity. The pattern is clear." His colleague, a younger woman with fierce eyes, tapped her pen against a document. "We can file by Monday. The beauty is that we have so many witnesses now. People are no longer afraid to come forward." That same day, Sheriff Sheila held a press conference outside the department. I watched it on a live stream, studying her face. Gone was the arrogant smile, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace as she read from prepared remarks. "These allegations are baseless attacks on our department's integrity," she claimed, her voice lacking its usual authority. "We maintain our commitment to protecting this community from all threats, including the threat of misinformation." But her words rang hollow. The reporters pressed her with questions based on the evidence we had presented. When asked directly about threatening my daughter, she fumbled. "I simply reminded a young person about the consequences of disrespecting law enforcement," she said, sweat visible on her forehead despite the cool day. The lawsuit was filed the following Monday. Harrington v. Sheriff's Department of Oak Ridge County. Seeing our name on the legal documents made it real in a way nothing else had. This was no longer just our fight. It was a matter of public record, of legal precedent. 3 days later, Sheriff Sheila received formal notice of an inquiry by the State Law Enforcement Standards Board. The small envelope delivered to her office set off a chain reaction within the department. Deputies who had once followed her orders without question now strategically requested transfers or suddenly remembered family commitments that kept them away from controversial assignments. I was in the grocery store when Deputy Miller approached me, not in uniform but in civilian clothes. He glanced around nervously before speaking. "Listen," he said quietly, "I want you to know that not all of us agreed with how she handled things. Some of us tried to tell her she was crossing lines." I studied his face, remembering how he had stood silently behind her during many of her intimidation tactics. "And yet, you followed orders." He looked down. "I have a family to support, but I have given a statement to the inquiry board about things I witnessed, things she ordered us to do to other families before yours." The inquiry proceeded with unexpected speed. Sheriff Sheila was summoned to the state capitol to testify under oath. I was called as well, bringing our evidence and witnesses. The hearing room was austere and formal, nothing like the emotional town hall meeting. Here, the law spoke in measured tones and precise language. Sheriff Sheila entered flanked not by deputies, but by her personal attorney, a sign of how quickly her department had distanced itself from her. She sat stiffly in her uniform, which suddenly seemed too large for her frame. When asked about targeting my daughter, her defense crumbled quickly. "I was ensuring respect for law enforcement," she insisted. "By threatening a minor?" the chairwoman of the board asked. "I never threatened." "We have sworn testimony from a teacher who heard you, Sheriff," the chairwoman interrupted, holding up the document. "And now we have testimony from your own deputies about a pattern of similar behavior." I watched her face as she realized her own people had turned against her. The betrayal in her eyes was quickly replaced by something else: fear. For perhaps the first time, Sheriff Sheila understood what it felt like to be powerless against authority. As I left the hearing room that day, reporters called out questions. I declined to comment, but I could not help the small smile that formed as I walked to my car. The system that Sheila had manipulated for so long was finally working as it should, not through force or intimidation, but through due process, evidence, and testimony. Justice was coming, slowly, methodically, inevitably, just as the law intended. The change in our town did not happen overnight, but once it began, it spread like ripples in still water. First came the signs in windows, small, handmade posters declaring "Protect our rights" and "No one above the law." Then the local diner, once Sheriff Sheila's unofficial headquarters, removed the framed photograph of her that had hung by the register for years. "Bad for business," the owner told me when I came in for coffee. "People want to eat their breakfast without feeling watched, you know." The high school held an assembly on civic responsibility and constitutional rights. My daughter was asked to speak about her experience. I sat in the back of the auditorium, watching with a mixture of pride and lingering concern as she took the microphone. "I just took a picture," she began, her voice small at first, then growing stronger. "I never thought it would lead to this, but I learned something important. When people with power abuse that power, staying silent only protects them, not us." The students applauded, and several teachers wiped away tears. The principal, who had once bowed to Sheriff Sheila's pressure to discipline my daughter, now stood and applauded loudest of all. Outside the school that afternoon, a group of parents approached me in the parking lot. "We are organizing a petition," said Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son played on the soccer team, "calling for independent oversight of the sheriff's department. Would you be willing to help us with the legal language?" I agreed immediately. That weekend, they gathered signatures outside the grocery store, the hardware store, even after Sunday services at the local churches. People who had once averted their eyes when we passed now stopped to sign, to share stories, to thank us for speaking up. Not everyone approved, of course. Sheriff Sheila still had her supporters, people who believed in her brand of harsh order, who feared change more than they feared abuse of power. They drove past our house slowly, sometimes shouting from their windows. One morning we found our mailbox knocked over. My daughter noticed my concern as I repaired it. "They are just trying to scare us again," she said, holding the toolbox. "It will not work this time." She was right. We had moved beyond fear, and we were not alone anymore. The local paper, which had once published only the most favorable coverage of the sheriff's department, ran a 3-part investigative series titled "Badge and Power: When Protection Becomes Control." They interviewed dozens of residents about their experiences with Sheriff Sheila's aggressive policing. The reporter called me for comment. "This is not about targeting one individual," I told him. "This is about changing a system that allowed abuse to flourish unchecked." Even local businesses began to take sides. The Chamber of Commerce, which had previously invited Sheriff Sheila to speak at every annual meeting, now declined to include her in their planning. The annual law enforcement fundraiser, usually held at the country club, was quietly postponed indefinitely. One evening, a convoy of cars drove slowly through town, hazard lights blinking. It was not a protest exactly, but a silent statement. Community members driving past the sheriff's department, past the courthouse, past town hall. No signs, no shouting. Just citizens reminding those in power, "We are watching now." Sheriff Sheila's public appearances became rare. When she did emerge for official business, gone was the swagger, the hand resting casually on her weapon. Now she moved quickly, eyes down, speaking only when necessary. At the next town council meeting, attendance broke all records. People stood along the walls, spilled out into the hallway. When public comments began, A line formed at the microphone. Person after person called for reform, for oversight, for accountability. Councilwoman Parker, who had always supported the sheriff, looked uncomfortable as the testimonies continued. Perhaps, she suggested weakly, we should form a committee to review police procedures. A committee is not enough, called someone from the back. We need real change. The applause was deafening. Walking home that night with my daughter, I noticed she stood taller, her steps more confident. The weight of intimidation had lifted from her shoulders, from all of us. "Do you think it will really change?" she asked. "Or will everything go back to how it was once people forget?" I considered her question carefully. "Change is never permanent unless we make it so," I answered. "But now people know they have a voice, and that is something they will not easily forget." As we rounded the corner to our street, neighbors waved from porches, called out greetings. We belonged here now, truly belonged, in a way we never had before. Not as outsiders who kept their heads down, but as members of a community finding its courage. The morning of the final hearing dawned clear and cool. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the trees, thinking about how much had changed in the months since my daughter had taken that fateful photograph. My coffee had grown cold when she joined me, already dressed in her navy blue blazer and skirt, an outfit we had chosen together for this day. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the importance of what lay ahead. The state capitol was a 2-hour drive. We made the journey in contemplative silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The courthouse stood imposing against the blue sky, its marble columns gleaming in the morning light. Already, a small crowd had gathered on the steps, supporters from our town who had made the journey, reporters with cameras and microphones, curious onlookers drawn by the unusual case of a sheriff on trial. Inside, the hearing room was austere and formal. We took our seats in the front row. Our attorneys nodded reassuringly as they arranged their documents at the table. Across the aisle, Sheriff Sheila sat with her legal team, her uniform impeccably pressed but her face drawn and pale. She did not look in our direction. The 5-member panel of the State Law Enforcement Standards Board entered, and the room rose in unison. The chairwoman, Justice Eleanora Watkins, a distinguished former judge with silver hair and piercing eyes, called the proceedings to order. Today we conclude the investigation into allegations of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and intimidation by Sheriff Sheila Maddox of Oak Ridge County, she announced, her voice filling the chamber. "We have reviewed extensive testimony and evidence over the past 3 months. My daughter's hand found mine as we waited. I gave it a reassuring squeeze. For 2 hours, the board methodically reviewed their findings. They cited specific incidents, patterns of behavior, testimony from deputies and citizens alike. Sheriff Sheila stared straight ahead, her posture rigid, as they detailed case after case of overreach and intimidation. Most troubling, Justice Watkins continued, is the calculated targeting of a minor citizen for exercising First Amendment rights. The evidence shows a disturbing escalation of intimidation tactics directed at a high school student whose only action was posting a photograph of public property. When it was time for the final determination, the room fell completely silent. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the soft rustle of papers, the shallow breathing of those around us. "It is the unanimous finding of this board," Justice Watkins declared, "that Sheriff Sheila Maddox has engaged in systematic abuse of authority, willful violation of civil rights, and intimidation of citizens under color of law. These actions render her unfit to serve in law enforcement capacity." A collective gasp moved through the room. My daughter's grip on my hand tightened. Sheriff Maddox is hereby removed from office, effective immediately. Her law enforcement certification in this state is permanently revoked. The board further recommends that the state attorney general's office review this case for potential criminal charges. Sheriff Sheila's face drained of all color. Her attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but she seemed not to hear him. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. In hers, I saw something I had never expected, not anger or defiance, but shock. The shock of someone who had never imagined consequences would reach her. As we exited the courthouse, reporters surged forward, microphones extended. Camera flashes popped in the bright sunlight. I had prepared for this moment, knowing what needed to be said. Today's decision affirms a principle fundamental to our democracy, I stated clearly for the cameras. No one, not even those who wear a badge, is above the law. This case was never about revenge. It was about accountability. A reporter called out, "What would you say to other communities facing similar abuses of power?" I considered the question carefully. Document everything. Find allies. Speak truth, even when your voice shakes. The systems of justice can work, but only when we have the courage to use them. My daughter stood beside me, composed and dignified beyond her years. When asked how she felt, she answered with simple eloquence, "I hope no other kid has to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them." As the crowd dispersed, a woman approached us, the mother of the autistic boy who had been wrongfully detained. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced my daughter, then me. "My son slept through the night for the first time in months when he heard she was suspended," she whispered. "Thank you for finishing what many of us were too afraid to start." The drive home felt surreal. The weight that had pressed upon us for so long had lifted, leaving an almost dizzying lightness in its place. As we passed the "Welcome to Oak Ridge" sign at the town limits, my daughter rolled down her window, letting the wind rush through her fingers. "Is it really over?" she asked. I glanced at her, this remarkable young woman who had endured intimidation with courage, who had stood firm when adults had faltered. "This chapter is," I answered truthfully, "but the work of maintaining justice never really ends." We pulled into our driveway as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. Neighbors stood on porches, in doorways, at fences. Word had traveled faster than we had. As we stepped from the car, someone began to applaud. Then another joined, and another, until the quiet street filled with the sound of hands coming together in celebration and relief. My daughter looked around in wonder at the community that had finally found its voice. In her eyes, I saw not just the end of fear, but the beginning of something far more powerful, the knowledge that one person's courage can change everything. In the weeks that followed Sheriff Sheila's removal, our town experienced what can only be described as a collective exhale. People smiled more easily on the streets. Children played outside later into the evening. The temporary sheriff appointed by the county commissioners moved through the community with a quiet respect that felt refreshingly unfamiliar. I returned to my normal routine, teaching online courses, managing household affairs, being a father to my remarkable daughter. But something had changed permanently in both of us. We had witnessed firsthand how fragile rights could be, and how vigilantly they must be protected. One evening, I sat at my computer, staring at a blank document. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting. I had been invited by the state's largest newspaper to write an opinion piece about our experience. Words had been my professional tools for years, yet now I struggled to find the right ones. My daughter peered over my shoulder. "Still nothing?" she asked. "Finding the right balance is difficult," I admitted. This cannot be about celebrating one person's downfall. It needs to be about preventing the next abuse of power. She considered this, then pulled up a chair beside me. Then write it for the next kid who gets targeted. Write it so they know they are not alone. With her wisdom guiding me, the words finally came. I wrote about small towns and silent suffering, about how power concentrated in unaccountable hands inevitably corrupts, about how our legal systems are imperfect tools that nonetheless remain our best protection against tyranny. The piece was published on a Sunday with the headline, "When Those Who Enforce the Law Break It, A Father's Perspective on Rural Policing." By Monday afternoon, it had been shared thousands of times online. By Tuesday, I had received invitations to speak at law schools, civil liberties conferences, and community forums across the state. My daughter found her voice as well. The State Civil Liberties Youth Board invited her to join their advisory panel. Once a month, she traveled to the city for meetings where young people discussed their rights and responsibilities as citizens. She returned from these trips energized, full of ideas and new perspectives. "There are kids dealing with way worse things than what happened to me," she told me after one such trip. "Some of them have been profiled because of their race or detained for speaking out at school. We are working on a handbook to help them document everything properly." Our home became an unofficial information center. People called or visited, seeking advice about interactions with authorities. I connected them with lawyers, helped them draft complaints, taught them to document incidents. It was not the quiet life I had envisioned when we moved here, but it was meaningful in ways I had never anticipated. The town itself was changing too. The council established a civilian oversight committee for the sheriff's department. Body cameras became mandatory for all deputies. Complaint procedures were simplified and made more accessible. Not everyone appreciated these changes, of course. Some longtime residents grumbled about outsiders changing their way of life. Others insisted that a firmer hand in law enforcement had kept the town safer. But these voices grew fainter as new leadership demonstrated that respect and accountability could coexist with effective policing. 6 months after Sheriff Sheila's removal, the town held a special election for her replacement. The winning candidate, a former state trooper with a reputation for community engagement, invited me to coffee shortly after taking office. "I want to learn from what happened here," she said simply. "I never want to repeat those mistakes." We talked for hours about the balance between authority and accountability, about how easily power can corrupt when unchecked, about the particular challenges of policing in small communities where everyone knows everyone. As spring returned to our small town, so did a sense of renewal. The community center hosted a Know Your Rights fair, where attorneys volunteered to answer questions about civil liberties. My daughter staffed a booth specifically for young people, explaining their rights regarding searches, questioning, and social media. Watching her confidently speaking with her peers, I felt an overwhelming pride. The shy teenager who had once been intimidated for taking a photograph was now empowering others to stand up for themselves. "You have changed," I told her as we walked home that evening. She smiled. "We all have, Dad, the whole town has." She was right. What had begun as our personal fight had become something larger, a community rediscovering its voice, its power, its responsibility to hold authority accountable. That night, I stood at the same kitchen window where I had once spotted patrol cars idling suspiciously outside our home. The street was quiet now, peaceful, not because fear kept people silent, but because respect had replaced intimidation as the foundation of order. My daughter joined me, leaning her head against my shoulder as we looked out at the town we had helped transform. "Do you think it will last?" she asked softly. I put my arm around her shoulders, considering the question carefully. "Nothing lasts without effort," I answered truthfully. "But now everyone knows that change is possible, and that knowledge, that is permanent." In the distance, a police cruiser passed slowly down Main Street. The new sheriff raised her hand in a respectful wave to pedestrians, who waved back without hesitation. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything we had fought for: authority exercised with accountability, power tempered by respect. This was our victory, not perfect, not complete, but real. And in this small town that had once been ruled by fear, that was enough to build upon.